The last two Baylor football coaches are changing college football as we know it. Let's get locked on Baylor.
You are Locked On Baylor, your daily podcast on the Baylor Bears. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello there, Bears fans. Welcome to another episode of Locked On Baylor, brought to you by FanDuel and part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. I'm your host, Cam Stewart of ESPN Central Texas and the Cam Show on YouTube, powered by Rogue Media Sports Network. Appreciate you making it your first listen today and every day. On this Monday, we're going over how the last two Baylor football coaches are actually changing the game, like literally changing the sport. Kind of. Also reminiscing on the weekend that was in Baylor basketball and one of the great comeback victories they have ever had. Why this issue between Kansas and Baylor goes much deeper than this one game. And the Jayhawks have a bogey team in your Baylor Bears, and what Baylor needs to do in order to possibly win a humongous game without VJ Edgecombe. It's certainly not the situation they wanted to be after such a big win. All that and more coming up on this episode of Locked On Baylor. You know, it's kind of funny. There's been so many debates between, the Matt Rhule, Dave Aranda eras of Baylor football and the people that want Matt Rhule back and saying that Dave is overrated versus the people that say, Dave was winning with the guys Matt Rhule couldn't. And they're kind of intertwined in their eras, here at Baylor football. They're all trying to kind of catch up to, honestly, what Art Briles had built, for better or for worse, right? In terms of on the football field, that's what they're trying to catch up to. And here is Matt Rhule, former Baylor football coach, most likely about to change college football. And he's actually taking that idea directly from the guy who replaced him at Baylor in Dave Aranda. Because Matt Rhule over the weekend had a midwinter press conference, something Dave would never have, talking about the spring game coming up in April. Now, this is Nebraska, right? They had 60,000 people at their spring game last year. And yet he told the assembled media, probably not going to have a spring game this year. The clutching of the pearls. Because that's exactly what happened at Baylor last year. Remember? Dave Aranda, they pinned it on the weather, but from all that we heard, Dave did not want a spring game. And there's been no announcements for like a plans of a spring game this year for Baylor. And one thing that I brought up at the end or during that whole kind of controversy last year of fans being real upset that there was no spring game was, I wonder how much of this has to do with the transfer portal. And that's something I had heard from people around the Baylor football program that, you put these things on ESPN Plus or, some other schools you do, Nebraska's was on the Big Ten network, SEC network, and it's all available for everybody to see. And you're tweeting out all the big plays that this guy you've never heard of makes. And like, that seems like good fun for fans, and it is, but that is something that coaches look at when it comes time to open the transfer portal right after the spring game. They see this receiver caught 2 long bomb touchdowns, or a quarterback who can throw it 50 yards, or a defensive end who had a couple TFLs and a sack and, pretend sacks in a spring game, or a corner had a pick. And it's like, that's tape. For guys who don't get into games, that's game tape. And Matt Rhule is using that same excuse at Nebraska. Here's what he told the media. He said, the word tampering doesn't exist anymore. It's an absolutely free, open, common market. I don't necessarily want to open up to the outside world and have people watch our guys and say, he looks like a pretty good player. Let's go get him. And that's what it all boils down to. And the way he's saying, tampering doesn't exist. Obviously, there is still rules against tampering, but in 2025, there's just so many ways to get around it. We talked about it with Brandon McKinnon on the show the other day, on Thursday's show, where he was talking about how many different avenues people can go to hear from what programs have to offer or what players are looking for without being player to program communication. And that is something that happens obviously a lot when it comes to the college football transfer portal. It happens before the spring games. It happens after the spring games. And I think, with Dave Aranda starting it last year and Matt Rhule and in a big name program like Nebraska doing it in 2025, I doubt we'll see any spring games 4 or 5 years from now. If this is the structure that the transfer portal is going to operate under, we're not like gone will be the days of the spring game. And I get it. Like, I totally get it. I think that's a problem on the NCAA as a whole, not these individual programs that say, "Hey, we're not doing a spring game." But honestly, I was one of those people upset last year that Baylor didn't have one, because I'll use a line from the former host of this show and Locked On Big 12 host Drake Toll. Everybody wins the spring game. Everybody. And it is just it's for the fans. It's for all of us to be excited about the team no matter what you're coming off of. And that's why I was so critical last year. It's like, man, 3-9 from a year ago, you need some good PR in here. And the flip side of that coin is the team doesn't owe us anything, especially when it comes to what their depth chart is going to look like. It just stinks. That's all. It's not something they're absolutely required to do. I know at TCU, a school very much like Baylor, Gary Patterson, if he could have never done a spring game, he would have. If he could have gotten away with it back then, he would have never done one. Now, that's going to become more commonplace. I wouldn't be stunned at all if you start to see a couple other big name schools not do it this year. And there's no real data to go back and look to see who canceled their spring games last year. It was few and far between. Like, Baylor was the biggest name to do it in 2024, but get used to it. It's going to start happening. And again, that does stink for the fans, but Nebraska, they saw 6 guys leaving the portal last year after their spring game, after they just went through a month or two of finding out who can do what and how they're going to fill out their roster. They put this thing on the Big Ten Network and ESPN Plus, and all of a sudden they got 6 guys off the roster. Baylor lost 5 after the spring game last year, which wasn't even televised. So, or in that spring window, I guess I should say. They added a couple more, but there's going to become a point where these big time programs are going to say, or maybe all programs are going to say, you know what, it's not worth it. It's not worth it to have our fans come out and, get their autographs on a poster. We can do that some other time. We can do some sort of pep rally another time. But we're losing guys who we thought were going to be contributors to our team because we're playing this scrimmage for everyone to see. And we've got it, play by play and everything. So once again, Matt Rhule was replaced by Dave Aranda at Baylor, and now he is replacing Dave Aranda as the trendsetter of the getting rid of the spring game, because it's going to happen all over the place. I'm curious to hear what you guys think about it. If you'll get involved in the YouTube comments, let me know what you think about not having a spring game. Is this something that's going to catch on? Is Matt Rhule and Nebraska overreacting? Was Baylor and Dave Aranda overreacting? Will Baylor have a spring game? Let me know in the comments below, or tweet at us at RealCamStewart or at Locked On Baylor. Obviously, you can find us here on YouTube or wherever you find your podcasts. Locked On Baylor rolls on. Next, we are looking at the miraculous comeback that the Bears had over the weekend against Kansas and what really contributed to that 60-point second half and massive comeback win. The real story is next on Locked On Baylor. But first, this is a message brought to you by Intuit TurboTax. You guys know taxes was waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back, and then waiting, wondering, and worrying some more. Now, taxes is matching with a TurboTax expert who can do your taxes as soon as today. An expert who gives your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find every deduction possible and file every form, every investment, everything with 100% accuracy, all so you can get the most money back, guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now, this is taxes. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live full service, real-time updates only in iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. Kansas has a Baylor problem. Yeah. They've also got a Texas Tech problem. But they have plenty more problems under the surface from what we saw on Saturday. The biggest choke in Kansas basketball history, the biggest blown lead they've ever had. Kansas has been playing basketball for a long time. I think you guys might know that. A long time, 120 some odd years. And the worst loss in terms of a blown lead they've ever had was Saturday against the lowly Baylor Bears. This Baylor Bears team that so desperately needed a win. And yet Kansas was rolling. Up 21 in the first half, up 19 at halftime. Hunter Dickinson having himself a day. Everything going right for Bill Self's Jayhawks. Until they had to play a second half. Dang, isn't that a bummer, Bill, that you got to go out there and play a second half? And then it's all Baylor. 60 points in the second half. They make up that 19-point deficit and then some. They win by 11. The quick math here, folks. Big 12 math. That's a 30-point swing from the first half to the second half. That does not happen often. It shouldn't happen with a Baylor team that struggled offensively and lost their best player midway through the second half. And it should never happen to the Kansas Jayhawks. So what happened, Hall of Famer Bill Self? What happened from the first half to the second that led to such disastrous results for your team?
I honestly believe the oranges that we ate at halftime that Baylor provided was probably the reason why we sucked the second half. So,
likely story. It could well be. Who knows what Baylor did to those oranges at halftime in Kansas's locker room? I mean, look, I got to say this. I know this is sacrilegious as a fan of another team in the Big 12. I kind of like Bill Self. He's very folksy, and he's never going to lean into, like, he doesn't want to give you the grabby quote, really. Like, he'll give you something like that where it's obviously tongue-in-cheek. But that's a double-edged sword. It certainly feels good after a win when he's got some folksy, funny comments. But then after a loss, he'll give you some of that. And I'm sure KU fans hated to hear that. And then every once in a while, he'll give you the infamous quote like he gave last year about giving up on his team 3 weeks before the end of the season. So it's a double-edged sword with having the Hall of Famer Bill Self. But here's the problem. Before we get into kind of the numbers of this thing, Kansas, they're just not your slightly older brother's Kansas. We said this last year, and honestly, this year's team looks like a carbon copy. Better roster, better health, and yet they still look the same. Man, they struggle to win big games on the road. Hunter Dickinson goes missing for more than half the game, and they can't beat these teams that are supposed to be the plucky upstarts, teams that Kansas is supposed to roll over. And you look at the last couple of years from, I would say, kind of the faltering of the Kansas program. And obviously that's very relative. Like, they're still very good. And they did win a national championship in 2022 after Baylor won one in 2021. But I would look at really the last 3 or 4 years, which, does include a national championship season. And they're having trouble with these games they just used to walk over, right? 14 straight conference championships. Regular season conference championship, which is more impressive than winning the conference tournament. And since then, since they lost out on that, I'll be a nice guy and say 14 in a row. Of course, 2018 is vacated, but I'll be a nice guy and include that. Since then, only 1.5. And since then, they've also struggled against some of those upstart programs that have made the Big 12 into a deeper, better conference. Those two being Baylor and Texas Tech. Kansas has not beaten Baylor in Waco in 5 years, since pre-COVID. Like, we were about to find out what COVID was a few weeks later. It was a full house, college game day. Azubuike had a tremendous game, and since then they have not won in Waco since. Now, for Baylor fans of my vintage, of my ilk, okay, that was something so beyond our wildest dreams 6 years ago, or 5 years ago, or 3 years ago, that you're going to beat them at home 5 years in a row. That's 5 straight years where you beat Kansas. I don't care where it is. And in fact, it's 6 straight because they beat them on the road in 2020. 6 straight years beating Kansas. That was not an option when I was in college 10 years ago. Not that long ago. I started college 10 years ago. That wasn't an option to beat Kansas. They did it once in my 4 years at Baylor, and that was the first time they had beaten them in 5 years. So the class before me did not see that happen, or 2 years before me did not see that happen. And Texas Tech, same thing. Texas Tech has made Kansas stub their toe quite a bit over the last couple of years. In fact, while they haven't had the run that Baylor's had against Kansas, in Tech's last 4 losses to the Jayhawks, the margin has been under 5 points, 4.75. In Tech's last 4 wins against Kansas, the margin is 19.5 points. So when they beat Kansas, they beat the hell out of Kansas. That includes a 29-point victory against the Jayhawks after KU beat Baylor by 3 as a game-tying 3 rimmed out at the buzzer at Allen Fieldhouse last year. So these games that used to just be foregone conclusions for Bill Self and the Jayhawks are no longer that way. The rest of the conference has more or less caught up to Kansas. And that's not even mentioning Houston, who's the new team to the conference, has beaten them 2 years in a row and destroyed them at the Fertitta Center last year, and then won in Allen this year and won the Big 12 last year. Is probably going to do the same thing this year, them and Iowa State, right? Iowa State, they walked Kansas a couple weeks ago. They beat them last year too. Like this is just not throw on the uniform with the 6 letters in red, white, and blue across your chest and go out there and win the Big 12. That's the deeper problem for Kansas here. But the problem in terms of the day is they gave up 60 points in the second half. 60. And VJ Edgecombe was out for half of them. Half of that half, he was gone. And the other big problem is the intestinal fortitude, the balls of this team. Okay, because they go into the half with a 19-point lead. I don't care where you're playing. I don't care if you're a road team at Allen Fieldhouse. If you're up 19 at the half, you should win that game. They not only blew that lead, but then they went back up 10 in the second half. People forget that. Baylor took a lead at whatever, 49, 47 or whatever it was. And then Kansas went up 59-49. Like it was like after VJ goes down, you're like, okay, this is over now. This was nice, but I don't have to do a post game. Like it's over now. And then Baylor comes back again. That's a big time issue that Bill Self can laugh off with the oranges in the post game, but certainly can't going forward. And I think they've got Iowa State next. I think they've got Iowa State at Allen on tonight. Quick turnaround. Obviously, Baylor has a big-time game against Tech on the road on Tuesday. Oof, that's going to be tough. But there are so many issues with this Kansas team. And look, it's credit to Baylor as well. Credit to Rob Wright for having a huge second half, 20 points in the second half, filling in for VJ in terms of the scoring. Norchad Omier had, I think, 1 point in the first half? Am I right on that? Yeah, 1 point, 0 of 4 from the floor in the first half. In the second half, even with foul trouble, he goes right at your man, Hunter Dickinson, for 17 and 11 to go 18 and 16 on the game. And now people might start listening to me when it comes to Hunter Dickinson, who's the most overrated player in the country, because he's first half Hunter. That's what he is. First half Hunter, first 20 Dickinson. Like that's what he is. And he'll give you a good 10 or 12 minutes every game, a very high level 10 or 12 minutes every game. But A, it's not usually the last 10 or 12 minutes. And B, it doesn't go more than 10 or 12 minutes because he did it again. Now the scoring was a little bit more even, but 12 points in the first half, 8 in the second half. But you guys watching the game, Hunter was really giving them fits the first 10, 12 minutes of the game. And then after that, he was a non-factor. And his major numbers have gone down, including rebounding in this year. 7'2" guy, and his rebounding numbers are going down. Overrated. Nice player. Good player. Not National Player of the Year stuff. Not first team All-American stuff. He's just not. And Norchad's coming off a terrible stretch, and he just takes it to Dickinson in the second half. Baylor is having a nice weekend here. Kansas has some real problems. And until Kansas can start rolling over teams like Baylor and Tech and even a Houston, because, Houston's better than those two teams, but in terms of name brand, until Kansas can start rolling over those teams again, then their fans are not going to see them as real Kansas until then. And you're going to see more of this 3 seed, 4 seed. hoping to get out of the, first weekend, Sweet 16s, an accomplishment. That used to not be the case for Kansas, but the way they're going right now, that certainly is. And you have to credit, Houston coming into this conference and thriving, Baylor absolutely stepping up their game the last 5-6 years, and Tech doing the same and becoming national kind of powers here for this stretch of time. Kansas has a lot of issues. Let me know what you think they are down in the comments below. Or am I overdoing this? Are they not overrated? Is Hunter Dickinson actually really good? Or are you agreeing with me? Let me know in the comments below, or tweet at us at Locked On Baylor, and catch us on YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Locked On Baylor rolls on. Let's look at the Bears side of this thing, what they did right in this game against Kansas, and how they can go forward with or without VJ Edgecombe, if they can do that without VJ Edgecombe. That's next on Locked On Baylor. But first, today's episode is brought to you by our good friends over at FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here. One game, two teams, endless possibilities. And there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. Whether it's predicting that first touchdown, calling the MVP, or even betting on the coin toss. Tails never fails, right? FanDuel makes it easy to get in on the action. With live betting all game long, you can adjust your bets as the game unfolds and feel the thrill from kickoff to the final whistle. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. Bet just $5, and if you win, you're going to score $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, official partner, there we go, of Super Bowl 59. Enough talk about Kansas. That'll be the national headline. Kansas blows it. Kansas chokes. And I love getting one over on Kansas, because I know how much it crushes their fans. I know how much it crushes them. This royalty of college basketball. I saw plenty when driving through Kansas and some of the surrounding states, Iowa included, going from Waco to Chicago. They saw the Baylor stuff, and they scoff. Some people talk to me about it. They hate losing to Baylor. They hate losing to Tech and to Houston, even though Houston's better than them. To be honest, I think they still hate losing to Iowa State, because they still can't believe that those teams are on their level. Can't believe it. But that's what they've played down to be totally honest. But what we need to focus on is what Baylor did in this game, because what they did was somewhat miraculous, right? I mean, with what we've seen from this team this year, not been great. And now they're shorthanded, right? Still no Langston Love, still no Jeremy Roach. Don't count on it. Don't hold your breath on those guys for right now. But Scott Drew did say that it sounded like until the night before Jeremy Roach was going to play in this game, and then he got a call the night before and said, no, he's not. And then the saving grace of these last few games, of when you had those guys out and the guy who's become your offense, VJ Edgecombe, he goes down as you're making this comeback in the second half. And it didn't look pretty at the time, although he was, Scott said he was celebrating pretty good after the game. We'll reevaluate it. You hope it's just a rolled ankle, which it looked like, but you saw the knee bend as well. And if something's structurally wrong with the knee, there are some times where you can walk off on your own power. You can walk just fine, but there's something deeper there. Now you need to see what Baylor can do without VJ Edgecombe, because the win they had on Saturday was great, but it was miraculous, mainly because they need VJ to succeed. But I'm not downplaying this win. I'm not. In fact, Scott Drew is certainly not. You heard Bill Self blame it on the Oranges after the game with the wry smile. But here's what Scott Drew had to say about his team scoring this big win over the Jayhawks on Saturday.
I've been here 22 years, and I don't know if I'm more proud of a group. I mean, down 21, limited numbers, VJ out, what that group was able to do. I'm glad it's on YouTube. I'll watch that again someday.
I mean, it really is one of the most improbable victories of the Scott Drew era. Like all of those factors included that he talked about. I know they had some big time shorthanded wins in 22 when they scraped out to win the Big 12 regular season, when they really were shorthanded in some of those games. Jeremy Sohan was running point for some of those games before it was cool. But Like, take out the kind of whatever championship victories aside, Big 12, national championship, Final Four. Like, this is one of the great wins of the Scott Drew era, because we were talking about it, and some analysts were certainly talking about it and dunking it in the first half of that game of, this is one of Scott's worst teams in a while here, and they're just not coming together. Everything going into the second half of this game, you said it's just not coming together. And are they actually good enough? And then the only guy who's been an offensive plus, really, the last 3 or 4 games is VJ Edgecombe. Wright had some good games in there, but the last 4 or 5, VJ was really turning it on. And then he goes down in the second half. And so for this team to band together, for Rob Wright to have yet another coming out party, for all of you who still don't know who Rob Wright is, yet another coming out party against Kansas with those 20 second half points, and Norchad Omier coming off his worst game as a Baylor Bear, having just a massive game in the second half with 18 points and 16 rebounds in total. And to go at what some people think is one of the best players in the country in Hunter Dickinson while doing it, that is improbable, miraculous, you might say. Again, I can't say this enough. It's the biggest blown lead in Kansas basketball history. And you did it with what looked like a mediocre team that was shorthanded. And all the players, and Scott Drew included, credited that crowd as a big reason why. And now it's going to be tough to string a couple together because Tech is still real good. Like I mean, golly, that win they had on Saturday after the complete BS that was thrown their way, with Grant McCaslin getting ejected and Toppin getting ejected as well. Like, that was ridiculous. That is shameful for the Big 12. And I know our pal from Locked On Texas Tech, Chris Level, who does the game, he does color for men's basketball, was ripping into the officials, and he absolutely should have. It was ridiculous. So they're going to be hungry. They're playing at home. That's a real tough thing to overcome if you don't have VJ Edgecombe. So if you're the type to do this for your sports teams, maybe pray for VJ Edgecombe at Baylor basketball that he is healthy and ready to go, because you're certainly going to need him against Tech. And then next Monday, you got UCF on Saturday, but then next Monday you've got Houston. So you're going to need him to be healthy in order to win some of those big games and really get Baylor back into the rankings and firmly back in the NCAA tournament picture. This certainly helps, that win against Kansas on Saturday. And they've been on that 8-9 line. Will probably go up from there. But if you continue to lose, if you lose 4 out of 5, you're back off the screen entirely again. So let me know what you guys think about that win on Saturday, where it ranks in terms of the Scott Drew era regular season wins for Baylor. Let me know down in the comments below. Let me know what you think about the spring game fiascos and whether the rest of this conference has caught up to Kansas. Let me know in the comments section below. Be sure to like and subscribe. We're still well over 70% of you watching these videos that are not subscribed to the channel. If you like the content, seriously, it helps us out a lot. It lets us know that you like the content here, and we're bringing you fresh Baylor content every single day, your number one source for Baylor sports news not connected to the university. And to be honest, we're doing better than those ones too. Thank you guys so much for making it your first listen today and every day. Go find us wherever you find your podcasts too. That helps out a ton. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, we're all over the place. And we'll see you later on today on your favorite show, Locked On Baylor.